Now, controlling the PO2 in your unit, which we talked about this being rule number one of rebreather diving, the failure of doing that can cause certain things. And we're going to talk about the physiological concerns of diving a rebreather and not paying attention to what you're doing.
Oh, I love this.
Now, before we start, I want you to talk about one thing, because one of the things that we learned during rebreather diving is what happens if you have a failure, if something happens. And we talked about that in scenarios where you're dealing with potential hypoxia, hyperoxia, hypercapnia, you flooded your unit.
Boom.
Right? You flooded your
Bubbles are
unit,
coming all out.
complete electronic failures, your computer rips out of the cable like it happened to you in Abaco.
Yeah, ripped right on out right before a classic dive. Really?
If any of that happens, what do we do?
The same thing over and over again. And you know that I actually believe, because of what we're about to talk about,
Yes.
that I have way more options by having a rebreather than I do when I'm on open circuit.
Of course.
So in a crazy way, maybe once you're proficient on a rebreather, is it too bold to say that I'm actually safer diving on a rebreather than I know open circuit? Would you agree with me?
Absolutely.
And now you're going to learn the why behind that statement. Okay. Now look. This is not the only way to handle these emergency skills. And in fact, I don't believe that this is the only way type of teaching. But I'm going to tell you that the ways that we're going to go over make sense to me and are logical and will keep you safe in every one of these emergencies. So I like them and I subscribe to this method, but it's not the only way. Now, let's go through each one. And we'll start with hypoxia. Your PO2 is too low. You're below a safe PO2. One thing that's going to happen is all three of your cells are going to be blinking red.
And vibrating if you have a Petro 3.
Like, hey, look, idiot, look at your PO2. You look at your PO2 and you're like, oh no, I have way too low of partial pressure. And I think you can set that on your shear water as when you want it to go red.
Yeah.
And I believe mine is at like 0.45. I think if they go below 0.5, it's vibrating and it's red. What do? You don't want to go hypoxic because you could pass out and go unconscious. Anything below about a 0.16, you're going to start potentially having a blackout in your eyes and you could pass out.
Well, let me read the potential side effects, but let's do it like they do on the drug commercials, where like people are like playing pickleball and enjoying their life while they're saying all these terrible side effects. So all right, so you do you're loving life, and here are all the things that can happen if you have hypoxia.
Okay.
So you can get lack of coordination, confusion, euphoria, inability to think clearly, unconsciousness, and death.
We don't want any of those things, right? So what do? Let me tell you what you do every single time. Not the only way, but that's what we recommend. Number one, you're on your unit. On the roof. You look, oh no, I'm getting hypoxic. Step one, bail out. Close your DSV. Take the regulator that would be hanging right here. I should have wore one. That's connected to your open circuit gap. Put it in your mouth.
And breathe.
Change your dive computer by touching a button that says, I'm now back on open circuit, and breathe on open circuit. Cut off your O2. Turn off your O2. O2 off. Tell your buddy. And then you're going to do a dill flush. You're going to do a dill flush on every single drill, even hypoxia. Why? Because that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't I want to add oxygen? Well, this is my school of thought. If you do a dill flush on every single one of these emergencies, you've now brought your unit back to a known safe gas no matter what emergency there is. No matter what. So you don't have to think anymore. I just know I need to get off, bail out, shut off my O2, and do a dill flush. Now look at your sensors. On a shear water, it will tell you what your PO2 should be reading at any depth based upon the dill gas that you have. By clicking a couple of buttons to the right, it'll say, oh, your PO2, if you did a dill flush,
Should be.
should be this. And now you look and it is. Great. Okay. I can go back on the loop because I have a safe gas. Diluent gas should be safe at any depth. I can now take off my open circuit regulator, put this back in my mouth, and I can, in a hypoxia situation, slowly add O2, slowly, and you're bringing that PO2 back up. Change your dive computer that you're back on, close circuit, and now you can be back on your unit. You just weren't paying attention. Any problem or situation that you can solve by getting back on the unit is better because you have tons of gas again. You're not going to burn out all of your gas.
Right.
And you solved the problem. You're going to hear me repeat this same way of dealing with every emergency. So let's see if I'm right. Let's see if this works in any one. Not the only way.
Right.
Before you chime in.
No. I will just say that hypoxia, because it's important, it can lead to unconsciousness and death without warning. So this is not one of those where you're going to like, oh, I'm feeling a little weird right now. What is going on?
So what should you do?
You just
watch this baby.
Pass out.
This is why we keep saying, pay attention to your PO2. Don't let it get down to a hypoxic level, because if you pass out, you can't solve the problem just like I told you.
Yeah.
What's the next one?
So instead of adding, like I noticed that my PO2 is getting high. It's like 1.4, 1.5 almost. Oh, I need to add some dill so I can bring it down. But I messed up. I wasn't paying attention. And I added O2. And now this thing went to 1.7 or something. It just skyrocketed. What do I do?
Okay, so you looked. Gus added a little too much oxygen.
What's this called, by the way?
It's at 1.7, 1.8. It's blinking red, I assure you. I'm hyperoxic. I have too much oxygen. What is the problem with that? It's a big problem. You could convulse underwater and die. But how do you solve it? Oh, this is going to sound very familiar. I'm on the loop. I'm hyperoxic, too much oxygen. I close the loop. I put the regulator in my mouth. I turn off my oxygen. I tell my buddy O2 is off, and I change my dive computer to be on open circuit, and I breathe.
Think.
And I'm on open circuit. I think, and I say to myself, oh yeah, I do the same thing on every single problem over and over again. I'm going to add a known gas, and I'm going to do a dill flush. Add dill into the unit. You're dill flushing the unit, and you're bringing down the PO2. Now you can put this back in your mouth, and you can continue to do that dill flush where you're bringing down that partial pressure to the diluent partial pressure, which I told you. You click a couple buttons to the right, and it tells you this is what your partial pressure should be reading on your safe diluent gas. And you're like, it is reading that. No problem. Now I'm at a safe dill flushed gas. It's never going to hurt you. And then you slowly bring it back up by adding oxygen again to your set point. In this case, let's pretend it was 1.2, and you continue the dive. So you see, by bailing out and always doing a diluent flush solves both now hypoxia and hyperoxic. It solves both of those with no problem.
I do want to add a couple things. So for hypoxia, I know that we made emphasis on the fact that you weren't paying attention and your levels dropped low or whatever. But sometimes hypoxia can happen because you didn't follow the 10 rules of diving. For example, you jumped in the water without turning your oxygen on. And you start going down and you notice, oh, I don't have a way to add oxygen. Or the oxygen feed is not connected. Happens sometimes as well. It's just not connected to the MAV, or you connected the wrong gas, or you failed to calibrate, or there's a lot of these little things, right? You didn't do your right checks. You weren't, you were distracted, etc., that we talked about on the rules that will contribute to you going hypoxic. Same thing for hyperoxia. There are problems that can happen. And the main difference is it's the same result. As you mentioned, the process is the same to bail out, but it's the same result in terms of hyperoxia can lead to convulsions, which ends up drowning you. And hypoxia, you pass out, which then ends up drowning you. So either way, you can drown and die. And both of them are without warning. You do not feel it happening. It just happens. So because of that, you need to know your PO2. You need to do your checks. You need to follow the 10 rules for safe CCR diving, which we talked about before.
Absolutely. And just remember that you're always safe by doing a dill flush. You are planning this to bring the proper diluent gas no matter what depth you're at. You could flush this unit with the diluent gas and always be safe at that point. And that makes it easy to remember these procedures. Bail out, breathe for a second, flush it with dill, no matter what happened. If it's hypoxia or hyperoxic, flush it with diluent, get the unit into a safe mode, and then adjust your PO2 up or down as needed because you're breathing on it now with a safe gas. Same procedure over and over again.
We mentioned some of the things that can lead to hypoxia, which are unrelated to you paying attention to your PO2 and just forgetting about it. There's also things that can lead to hyperoxia. So hypoxia has some things, hyperoxia has some things. For example, you started with a high percent of O2, or you started with too much O2 in your dill. People that start with like high mixes of nitrox, right, instead of air or whatever in their dill. And now when they add dill, they're adding way more oxygen than they're supposed to add, if they had air or even nitrox 32. You have too much oxygen leaking through your MAV because you're just chill and relaxed and you're not metabolizing so much, and that constant flow is just going up and up and up.
Or maybe the IP pressure is wrong on the first stage of the O2, right? Got to check
How
that
about this
stuff.
one you've seen before? Rapid descent. People that just bomb to the bottom of the ocean just to go as fast as possible.
Let's talk about that for a second, because this brings up a learning point. Listen, when you're going down, your partial pressure mathematically is automatically rising. So when you go down, partial pressure is rising and the air is collapsing and you can't breathe. What gas should you add? The diluent gas.
Correct.
Remember, it's always safe. So as you're going down, if you're air starved, just add diluent until you get to your depth that you're going to be at. You're always going to add diluent. Opposite, you're now going up in the dive. That's a risk of going hypoxic, right? Because you're automatically, mathematically dropping your partial pressure as you ascend. So you're watching your computer and it's dropping your partial pressure. Guess what? You can add oxygen a little bit and it will bring up the partial pressure. Or what's the other gas you can always add is diluent. But if you're going up, just think logically, and your partial pressure is automatically dropping, you would just want to add a little bit of oxygen as you're going up, and it becomes second nature to where you're able to keep that PO2 at 1.2, and you're basically going up to a stopping point. Yeah. Whatever your dive computer says to stop at. I don't know what that's going to be for you, but we know ultimately it's going to be 20 feet or somewhere between 10 and 20 feet minimum for a 3-minute safety stop. And that's when you're going to have an opportunity to get that partial pressure back to your set point because you're stopped at a particular depth. So that's going down raises your partial pressure automatically. Going up drops your partial pressure automatically. You can always add diluent. It's always a safe gas. If you're going up and ascending and your partial pressure is dropping rapidly, you don't want to go hypoxic, just add a little bit of oxygen.
Absolutely. I will say that when you start diving and getting more used to diving the rebreather, what happens is that you know that if you are breathing, right, your PO2 tends to go down if you're metabolizing more than what the unit is providing. So what happens in a lot of cases is that people see their PO2 go up high. Let's say they go to the bottom and they didn't add enough dill or whatever, and they are like, I'll just breathe it down. I'll just be at 1.5 for a while or 1.4 for a while or whatever. What happens with that is that it starts then messing with your oxygen clock, your CNS, central nervous system, oxygen toxicity. So let's talk about that because you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned these CNS things. And the thing that we get with CNS clock, with oxygen toxicity, is not something that we get with hypoxia and hyperoxia. Hypoxia and hyperoxia come to you without warning. They can just happen if you're not paying attention, and they can come at you without warning. Oxygen toxicity has some warnings. So let's talk about that. I'll just mention it, and if you want, you can chime in and talk about it. But there is a little, how do you call it? Like an acronym or whatever? Mnemonic? Right? It's called convented. All right? So the first one is convulsion, right? If you start convulsing, that's a pretty big sign of it. But some of these other ones are not related to a convulsion.
And if my buddy was convulsing, at that point, I basically am going to bring him up. If there's nothing in his mouth at that point, they say don't try to put something in their mouth. Just get him up. If something is in their mouth, I would probably bail my buddy out, put him on open circuit, right? And just bring him up because that convulsion is going to stop once they're out, once that partial pressure drops. And I told you, automatically is going to drop as you ascend.
Right. Don't take the loop out of their mouth to bail them out because then you won't be able to put it back in.
No, do not bail them out.
Right.
Yeah,
Keep them in the loop. The next thing out of the convented is vision. If you start having tunnel vision or challenges with your vision, you need to understand that, whoa, something is up here, right? And by the way, before I move on with hyperoxia, if you follow Woody's procedure with hyperoxia or with hypoxia and you cannot get your loop back to normal. Remember, we check what should my PO2 be at this depth. Let's say it's 0.8, okay? And you're reporting 0.4 or something weird, and you cannot get it to what is supposed to be, stay bailed out. That's one thing I wanted to add.
Great point.
Just don't get back on the loop. Stay bail out, go to the surface, your dive is over.
And you can always do that. You can always decide, I don't want to fix the problem. I want to bail out, and I want to go to the surface. That's never a wrong answer.
Correct. The next thing is ears, ringing in the ears. If you start having some ear problems, ringing, challenges with your hearing, that's probably a sign of oxygen toxicity, high oxygen toxicity. Nausea, mild to severe, continuous or intermittent. It doesn't matter if you start having nausea, that could be a sign of it. Twitching, usually facial muscles. Most frequent symptom is twitching. Irritability, behavior or personality change. You start getting mad for no reason. And dizziness, vertigo, disorientation, things like that. All of these are signs that you're pushing on your CNS clock. And we track these with OTUs, or oxygen toxicity units, which are based on depth and what PO2 you're diving on your dive. You mentioned there's a table. You can see the table below. But just to give you an example, if you keep it at 1.2, you mentioned there's two types of oxygen toxicity that we track. One is a single exposure limit, which in this case will be 210 minutes. So
long dive,
3.5 hours, pass beyond what the GO can do. So if you keep it at 1.2, you'll be fine. If you want to do 2.5 hours, you can go up to 1.4. That's the single dive limit. But if you're planning to do more than that within a 24-hour period, if you're staying at 1.2, you can do up to 4 hours of diving in 24 hours.
And guess who is always keeping track of your CNS clock? Mr. Shearwater is.
That's right.
So the entire time, if you start pushing your CNS clock, it's going to give you a warning. Reaching CNS clock maximum,
right?
Or CNS clock exposure. And that means you need to go up and you need to understand that you now have maximized your CNS clock and you may not be able to do another dive. You may have to wait 24 hours. So this will track based on your actual PO2 that you are diving at, your CNS clock for you, and it's automatically going to keep track of your surface interval and adjust that CNS clock back to reality, to exactly what you were diving at.
By the way, I'll just wrap up with this because you can see the table below, but the higher your PO2, the more dramatic the change on the oxygen toxicity unit. So just to give you an example, we talked about 210 minutes. So 3.5 hours you can spend at 1.2. When you go to 1.4, just a little bit higher. The 1.2 to 1.4 difference is not much when you're controlling it yourself. It goes to 2.5. So from 3.5 hours to 2.5, just by going a little bit. Now, if you go just a little bit more to 1.6, which we're telling people that is the upper limit, but they say, look, I'm going to do it at the upper limit. I want to minimize deco. 45 minutes.
I know.
45 minutes is what you can spend.
And your lungs are super sensitive. They can only tolerate a certain amount of partial pressure of oxygen for a certain amount of time. Don't mess around with it. Gus just told you all of the symptoms. They're very dangerous, of which the most could be convulsion. And frankly, if you're by yourself, you're separated from your buddy, and you convulse underwater, what's the risk? In this class, we tell you death, which we don't want to die.
Absolutely. Lastly, before we move on to the next chapter where we're talking about booms and what happens when things explode or just stop working completely, let's talk about chemicals. Yes. Chemical burns. Chemical situations.
Chemical burns, and we also need to talk about hypercapnia. But first, we'll talk about
hypercapnia as well.
First, we got to talk about chemical burns. Now, this sorb, when gets wet, turns into lime. It's poison, and it turns alkaline, basically like a battery.
Mm-hmm.
Alkaline in your mouth, in your body, is going to burn you. It's poison. It could kill you. It could destroy your vocal cords. It could cause a severe burn. So we cannot have this wet and have the loop in our mouth. No longer will remove the carbon dioxide, and it just turned into lime, which is poison, and it can burn you. So pretty simple. You can't ever forget that if this is not in your mouth, to close it before you take it out of your mouth. You can also never have bubbles, this boom that Gus talked about, because that means there's water getting into the unit as well, which basically is creating a poison with the sorb, which can kill you.
Yep. But let's talk about hypercapnia, because hypercapnia is important. And that is the level of CO2, not O2, the partial pressure of CO2 in your loop and what you're breathing.
Well, this one's very easy emergency. If you are feeling dizzy, confused, just out of your mind, you are potentially hypercapnic, which means the CO2 is no longer being removed. Maybe a mushroom valve failed and the gas is not flowing in the right direction, and you're breathing the same gas over and over again without that gas having a chance to be cleaned. Or you have channeling in there, where it means some of the gas is coming up through the sorb but not hitting the sorb. So you're breathing CO2. It's too damp. It's too wet. It can't clean it. You're over breathing the unit. You're breathing too fast, so it's not having enough dwell time to clean the gas. All of these things can cause hypercapnia. Why is that easy to deal with? Because there's only one thing you can do. If you are hypercapnic, you are going to close the loop, bail out of the unit, put it in your open circuit regulator, turn off your O2. You may have to vent a little gas out because your dive is over and these counter lungs are going to expand, so they could start accelerating. You could turn this loop upside down and vent it to let that expanding gas out as you're going up and you're on open circuit. Your dive is over. So if you're hypercapnic, you're bailing out, your dive is over. You changed your dive computer to open circuit. Follow your dive computer at that point. So with hypercapnia, pretty simple. Bail out, end your dive.
I think the benefit of understanding hypercapnia is looking for those symptoms. And Woody mentioned confusion, lack of coordination, being out of it. But there's actually one symptom before that, which is doubling your breathing rate. So what happens first, how you understand that something may be wrong, is that you're all of a sudden breathing a lot more often. That happens at the 0.03 PO2 of CO2. So CO2 also has a partial pressure. If you get to 0.03, you're doubling your breathing. You're breathing faster. You have to understand, before you're confused and all that stuff, you have to understand that what's going on? Why am I so, breathing so fast?
And when we plan this gas planning that we're talking about, which we have a section on that in our course, we plan to have enough gas as if we're going to have to bail out at not only at the deepest part of the dive, but also as if you're hypercapnic. And that when you switch to that open circuit, you're breathing for 3 to 5 minutes at a much faster rate.
Right.
A much higher SAF rate, SAC rate, surface air consumption rate, for 3 to 5 minutes, as much as 5 times more than you would normally breathe. So you better make sure you have enough bailout gas to handle that you bailed out at the deepest part of the dive while being hypercapnic. And we plan for that in our gas planning.
Yep. So that is, if you think about it again, 3% CO2, you're breathing 3% CO2, you're double the breathing. At 6%, you go into distress, confusion, which is what you talk about. You're still breathing fast, but now you're being all confused and all messed up. That, man, you have to bail out immediately.
Yes.
If you make it to 10%, so 0.10 of CO2, severe mental impairment. Like, you can't even function at that point. And if you make it to 12, death, loss of consciousness, and death.
And that's why we tell you there really is, this is a good way to wrap it up, with hypercapnia, only one thing you can do: bail out and end the dive.
And don't go back in the loop, because
not
obviously
go back.
something is wrong, right? Your scrubber is not scrubbing, like something in the system is allowing CO2 to circle back to you. So hypercapnia means you're bailed out and your dive is over.
And if you're the dive buddy and somebody gives you the thumbs up, the rule of thumb for technical rebreather diving, it should be for any diving, is no problem. No problem.
No questions asked.
I'm
It's
with
over.
you. Let's go up. Just say, okay, end the dive.
Let's talk about booms next.